I have been writing for 25 years or so. I have written 9 books now, many articles and essays, and poetry. I've also created some works of art. I keep a dream journal and have countless notebooks. I've also completed a master's degree and a doctoral degree, both of which required years of putting pen to paper or finger to keyboard. Only in my academic writing did I receive some formal training, but I still do not know how to type beyond the two-fingered method. In all my literary output, I received no training or coaching in the craft of writing. I simply do not conceive of my life as being that of an author. I do not consider the craft of writing as a career for me. I apparently picked up what I needed in order to say what I wanted to say, as I went along. When, finally, some kind individuals agreed to edit a small piece or two, I was shocked at the degree to which their careful editing exposed holes in my knowledge of grammar, spelling, punctuation, structural convention, formatting styles, etc. Why then do I write at all? One reason to write, of course, is to show others that you know what they know. That is, to communicate your intellectual readiness to enter a community which is dedicated to a particular discipline. In this kind of writing, the personality of the author is not a topic. Instead, the writer must rise up to the level of the theoretical I, that is, the voice of the discipline itself. Personal opinions or feelings are not wanted here. This intellectual demand is well captured in the requirement that the author write in the third person or with the I of the discipline, and to produce citations wherever epistemological claims are made. The granting of a degree is the public sign that the individual has reached the intellectual standards set by the discipline. Another reason to write concerns the craft of writing. An author may spend years developing and refining her craft, excelling at a genre, for example. The author's personality remains relevant here in the sense that we, the readers, can recognize the signature of the literary work. For example, Isaac Asimov's signature within the genre of science fiction novels is readily discernible. But there is yet another reason to write, one that has nothing to do with access to a body of knowledge or allegiance to an art form or genre of literature. I came across a vivid example of this reason to write recently in a movie, Quills, in the year 2000, which in part concerns the penmanship of the Marquis de Sade, played by Geoffrey Rush. He is imprisoned in an attempt to control his literary output, but pen and ink are smuggled in. When these are removed, de Sade uses wine and blood as ink. When these are denied, he uses his own shit to smear words on walls, etc. We can see from this example that another reason to write is because one is compelled to. With no regard for conventions, established genres, or anything else for that matter, the writer is simply seized. I write because something is happening to me that forces me to write. My body heats up in an inflammatory reaction that can only be quenched, at least partially, by writing a process going on within. Not writing about a process going on within, but writing it as it is happening. My early books expressed this process in detail, and I was too immersed in it to ask the question, what am I doing? What kind of writing is this? Is it a genre of writing, or at least the beginnings of one? I simply wrote. The fact that I could eventually ask this question, however, is a signal that, to some extent, the process was becoming conscious of itself and thus reflective. One of my early attempts to conceptualize the kind of writing I was doing appears this way. Quote, "I begin by paying attention to certain events occurring in the world, that is, events characterized by qualities of the unusual, the unfamiliar, the startling, all of which obviously involve my psychological participation. And then I open myself up to these phenomena sufficiently for them to penetrate my consciousness, so that I begin to think the thought of the phenomenon, distinct from my thinking about them. This process is, in effect, an initiation into another form of consciousness, the consciousness of the phenomenon. This, finally, can form the basis for a new action in the world, action that is not simply a repeat of the known past, but instead carries the germ of a new future. These actions always took me away from the security of the familiar into the unknown future. My method of writing is therefore an attempt to develop an art form that can demonstrate this process. I soften the boundaries of my ego and pay attention to unusual, unfamiliar, or even startling images that arrive. I take up a relationship with these visitors and am prepared to leave my present path to follow their hints. I record this process as it goes on. A kind of wandering therefore takes place in my writing, as in my life. In this way, I move from a memory to a dream to a reflection of an event in the world to an etymological study of a word to the words of another author. I do not concern myself with any separation between inner and outer, past and future, fact and fiction, that is, the usual categories of experience. The one constant is that all my writing springs out of the soil of immediate experience and so is real. I pay attention to detail or hints that emerge freely from within, no matter how small or seemingly is insignificant. It takes a kind of surrender to psychic process in order to write this way, and a faith that I won't fall merely into chaos or madness. But this is far from certain." End quote. This conception helped as I began to understand that the nature of my writing involved not any genre or established craft, but a breakdown in such categories, and indeed a breakdown of fundamental categories such as mechanical space and linear past, present and future, those very categories that constitute the background of our stabilized modern structure of consciousness. This early formulation distinguishes what I had believed was merely a personal breakdown from an objective breakdown of categories occurring in the background of modern consciousness. This real process at present has no category with which to name and therefore grasp it, since it involves a breakdown in categories. I could use names like fictive or imaginative, but these categories come loaded with a history that has deprived them of any truth or reality. In fact, these words currently mean the opposite: not real, fantasy, entertainment, falsity. But the phenomenology is conclusive. This process is real and has no referent outside itself. What I mean by this is, a breakdown of categories does not refer to outside of itself to a literal breakdown on a personal psychological level, or to the scale of a literal world catastrophe, although many people caught up in these background movements often make these misinterpretations. And yet, because this movement is the real background or the withinness of the world, then it follows that madness or world catastrophe are not to be excluded after all. How can we understand the necessity of this contradiction? An example may help us here. C.G. Jung had a series of world catastrophe visions just prior to the outbreak of the First World War. In his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he offers two contradictory interpretations. Being an experienced psychiatrist, he understood psychosis very well, and at first felt he was being menaced by one. But when the war broke out, he began to wonder instead how his personal inner experiences could have something to do with subsequent events in the real world, the catastrophe of the World War. The question of the connection between inner psychic events and outer events in the world became a lifetime's work for Jung, and is no less important and perhaps no more understood today. For the next several years following his visions, Jung was caught up in psychic processes that involved a breakdown in categories such as inner and outer, and he went through a very real personal breakdown that simulated psychosis. He had auditory hallucinations, he talked to invisible figures, extreme emotional states, etc. But, unlike madness, Jung's ego remained intact. He was able to reflect upon, as well as undergo, the breakdown in categories. His written record of this journey is now published as the Red Book. Jung's understanding of what he went through is complex and beyond the scope of this book, but we can touch on two aspects that are relevant here. On the one hand, after Jung emerged from his immersion in the breakdown, he returned to the familiar categories of inner and outer, and took up the question of how one could have anything to do with the other. For example, his theory of synchronicity is a sustained study, an attempt to find a theoretical connection between inner events, say a dream, and a coincidental event in the outer world. On the other hand, Jung seemed to accept the breakdown of categories, e.g. spatial and temporal categories that form the structure of modern consciousness, and to change accordingly in his own self-definition. He thus became initiated by the experiences themselves into a new reality. This initiation gave Jung the power to form new conceptions appropriate to this reality, and thus perceive new aspects of the real world. These new conceptions, for example, gave rise to his unique notion of the soul as absolute interiority, a conception subsequently fully developed by Wolfgang Gingrich. Jung's initiation into the new reality also led to his profound sense of being misunderstood right up to the end of his life. His complex and contradictory responses to the breakdown in categories have given rise to conflicting theoretical and methodological paths within the Jungian community that followed. However, they may be sympathetically understood as the result of a pioneer's attempt to face the sheer terror of participating in a breakdown of the very categories that support modern consciousness itself. And, if consciousness itself is undergoing a transformation, then personal breakdowns and world convulsions are highly likely, as our history demonstrates so well. One of the significant category breakdowns that is relevant to my articulating the genre of writing that this book is concerned with is that of the pair of opposites, doing and reflection. Within our modern structure of consciousness, we consider these a pair of opposites. We can do something in life or reflect on something in life, but not both at the same time. In the kind of writing I am suggesting here, it seems that both happen simultaneously, or something else happens that subsumes both within itself. I call this happening participation. Participation with the background processes of consciousness is reflection and doing, both, and yet neither. Thus, participation can be sharply distinguished from automatic writing, where the writer's consciousness plays no part. It is also different from having an experience and subsequently writing about that experience from memory. The writing that emerges from this participatory process, therefore, is a form, it's probably too early to call it a genre, that embodies such category breakdowns that I've talked about: inner, outer, past, present, future, action, reflection, etc. To this extent, such writing will appear crazy, as writers of this emerging form are forced to express mind-bending notions that are faithful to the phenomenon, yet incoherent when subjected to the requirements of our stable modern form of consciousness. I recently saw an example of such nonsense when I was awake late at night, unable to sleep. I was being besieged by these and other crazy thoughts. I turned on the TV and, to my surprise, saw a rerun of The Terminator, 1984. The heroine, Sarah, and her rescuer are being chased by the Terminator. They are resting in a tunnel where she seeks to understand the logic of what is happening. The machines had sent a Terminator back through time to kill her, so that she cannot give birth to the hero and then train him in warfare to save future humanity from the machines. The mere presence of this future machine forces this simple waitress to gain the very skills that the machines fear, to become pregnant with the Saviour and to gain the military skills to train him later. Her rescuer had been arrested, and a forensic psychologist listened to his story of travel from the future. He declared the prisoner completely delusional. The heroine, however, is willing to listen as he talks not of futures, but of possible futures. From their point of view, now in the present, they are confronted with possible futures penetrating the present. Here in the form of the Terminator, who is only one possible future. Their actions matter, although they cannot predict the outcome, for example, whether Sarah would be killed or not. It seems from this and other like examples that the idea of possible futures intersecting with the present and demanding action, without knowing the outcome, becomes important only when the usual categories that support present-day consciousness break down. There are many such instances of art forms that are now speaking this way and seem to be engaging the contemporary artistic mind. One such book is the compelling example of The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick, which is a partial collection of the mad writings of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. You may remember movies like Blade Runner and The Minority Report. This book, published posthumously, gives us a glimpse of his 8 years long immersion into the background of consciousness as long-held categories break down. In 1974, Dick had a revelation which ignited a superhuman feat of writing constantly over a long series of nights running to 8,000 pages. Quoting from the book now, a sudden discorporating slippage into vast and total knowledge that he would spend the rest of his life explicating. Close quotes. The posthumous publication of some of these texts highlights Dick's long and arduous attempt to understand what exactly was happening to him, in a similar manner to C.G. Jung's efforts as recorded in his Red Book. I can choose any page at random to get a feel for sheer movement taking place, onrushing fervour, a furore, gathering rapids, as punctuation breaks down or ceases really to matter, as an onrushing life begins to prevail. It's like navigating a maelstrom at times, with little islands emerging only to be swept away again. The structure of the book is described as a freewheeling voice that ranges through personal confession, esoteric scholarship, dream accounts, and fictional figures, one of the most improbable and mind-altering manuscripts ever brought to light. When I compared this description of Dick's writing with that of my own, I knew we had some common ground. For starters, I also underwent a prolonged meltdown in which the very categories that support our present-day consciousness dissolved. I was also forced to write my way out of it, and I learned the way out is via the way in. I had to participate more deeply in the material that was presenting itself to me, as Dick had to as well. My own efforts are recorded in some of my earlier books, among them Living in Uncertainty, Living with Spirit, and The Imperative. A key methodological approach in producing this kind of mad, in quotes, writing is that the author takes seriously whatever phenomenon presents itself to him, in its own terms. The author must be able to remain within the phenomenon long enough so that it can teach him what it means in terms of its own logic, no matter how crazy it may sound when appraised from the categories of our current form of consciousness. The author is thus compelled to think self-presentational thoughts that defy rationality. I'll give one example here from Dick's book Valis, which I also read with enormous enthusiasm subsequent to writing my final book so far, Image. In his book Valis, Dick tells us of a dream he had in which he is living with his wife. Quote, "I have had dreams of another place myself, a lake up north, and the cottages and small rural houses around its south shore. In my dream I arrive there from Southern California, where I live. This is a vacation spot, but it's very old-fashioned. All the houses are wooden, made of the brown shingle so popular in California before World War II. The roads are dusty, the cars are older too." Following the dream, which Dick accepts completely in its own terms, he begins to compare its reality with his present outer reality, which does not include many of the elements in the dream, such as having a wife or a property up north. He then gets a memory of his father and realizes that in his dream he is living his father's life as an alternative reality. From this achievement, Dick argues further that the individual contains the history not only of his personal life, but of our entire race, back to its origins, back to the stars. Quotes, "This is gene pool memory, the memory of the DNA." Now, this final thought regarding history within the individual has been discovered and articulated by others. In modern times, for example, C.G. Jung has developed a unique view of history, which is very close to Dick's, namely, that we are psychologically the outcome of many historical transformations in consciousness, all of which may be reconstructed in our modern minds with the correct methodology. History, as much as it is psychologically relevant to our lives, may be found within. The really significant point here that I want to make is that Dick did not gain this knowledge externally as a student of psychology might do so. Instead, initiated into it by the phenomenon, his dream, which he took to be as real as his waking life. His eyes were open to another reality. To take this line of argument a step further, we can ask what ultimately happens if, when the very categories that support our current form of consciousness break down, we stay immersed in the chaos that logically follows, as Dick does, and as I did in my case for about 15 years or so. The process at first appears mad, and both Exegesis and Valis feel that way from the perspective of our modern-day consciousness. But Dick emerges with an astounding conclusion, one that I am totally in agreement with on the basis of my own mad immersion. Dick discovered that a reversal in a fundamental polarity takes place. Let me explain this. For thousands of years we have slowly stabilized a form of consciousness that has a structure of order, disorder. Consciousness is order, and outside, beyond the boundary, is disorder, chaos, evil, etc. This was concretized in the structure of the early city-states, which were circular with a border or a wall that separated the order of daylight consciousness from what was felt to be outside disorder, evil, demonic. Now, this early consciousness was at first not stable enough or strong enough to withstand the incursions from chaos and had to be periodically consumed by this disorder and then renewed, and there were many ritual forms that in effect carried this out. It could not for many generations be relied upon to last forever. The dark irrational powers were a constant threat to the order of daylight consciousness and had to be held at bay by ritual acts of warding off. Also, periodically, they were given their day, a day ritualized, for example, by the ancient Saturnalia or the Celtic Day of the Dead. Over time, our daylight consciousness became stabilized enough for these rituals to lose their power and psychological necessity. Today they've degenerated into Halloween, for example. They have no psychological value. Now we live in a stable world of rationality which is occasionally threatened by events evaluated by us as irrational. Emotions, visions, delusions, psychoses, for example, all of which are dealt with primarily by medications today and thus warded off. The content of these irrational outbursts are not listened to or trusted in any way by the healing profession today. Now, with this short discussion of the history of our consciousness, we can gain more easily access to Dick's great discovery. He shows us that if we take madness seriously and in a sustained way, if we take it on its own terms, as it presents itself to us, then the fundamental polarity that has driven our Western culture for thousands of years, giving rise, finally, to our modern structure of consciousness, the rational-irrational polarity reverses itself. This is astounding. Dick outlines this reversal in his cosmogony as reported in Vilas. Quote, "The single most striking realization that Fat, the protagonist in the book, had come to was his concept of the universe as irrational and governed by an irrational mind, the creator deity. If the universe were taken to be rational, not irrational, then something breaking into it might seem irrational, since it would not belong. But Fat, having reversed everything, saw the rational breaking into the irrational. The immortal plasmate, a term he uses in Vilas, had invaded our world, and it was totally rational, whereas our world, the world of familiar consciousness, is not." Now, what this discovery means for us is this. Where we feel most sane is where we are, in fact, now insane. Our modern consciousness, over a long period of time, has separated itself and today has isolated itself from everything else. It's now the private self, and it's now psychotic in its structure. Yet, of course, it thinks of itself as totally sane. Furthermore, those aspects of our psychological being, dreams, visions, accidents, are the harbours of the very sanity that can cure us of the insanity of psychological isolation. This is also my conclusion based on many years of immersion in madness and taking them every bit as seriously as Dick does, until they restored me to sanity. This kind of writing demands both reflection and doing, what I earlier called participation. The ability of the author to engage this way probably determines the extent to which he legitimately could be called mad. The doing is a needing to act without knowing the outcome in the sense that modern consciousness knows. Subject-object knowing. If we know the outcome, then obviously we are merely repeating the past in some way, since present-day consciousness knows only in terms of the past, that is, memory. This doing can at first be frightening to those who feel the demand to act in this way, that is, without knowing. Yet one can get used to it and even become curious. If we participate with possible futures as they penetrate the present, does it matter how we act in relation to them? If it did not matter, then we'd be forced to acknowledge a deterministic universe or an intelligent designer. But possible futures more speak of a dark urge that agitates, burrows, seeking to get ahead, to enter material reality by finding any available opening. Philosophically, we could talk of this process as a union of teleology and contingency. Wounded individuals, like myself, are such available openings, and the dark urge simply enters. It's up to the individual to survive the onslaught as the burrowing spirit works its way into the world. And it is up to the individual to develop those soul capacities that will assist the actualization of possible futures in forms that will support biological and cultural life, rather than destroy it. There are many casualties of this impersonal process, and the record of such encounters constitutes culture in its many and varied forms. The impersonal nature of the burrowing spirit was brought home to me by a dream I had many years ago. In this dream, I am on a winding road in the country. I see a young woman throwing a boomerang in a field, and it comes my way. I pick it up and throw it. This attracts her, and she comes my way and joins me. We go by some animals and see a calf, split off from the herd, alone and bleating for its mother. It is near a snake. The cobra rears up, and it is golden. It climbs easily onto the calf's back. The calf can barely take the weight, and can do no more than try not to collapse. This dream frightened me. The snake, as the burrowing spirit, when it enters the world, must rest on a foundation. Mythically, we can think of the serpent wrapped around the world, or an egg, or a turtle, or resting on a turtle's back, curling around a tree, etc. But these animal aspects, as psychological realities, are today the most undeveloped aspects of the consciousness that gives rise to our modern Western culture. So the psychological foundation for accepting or receiving the burrowing spirit is weak, immature. D.H. Lawrence, as one modern writer, saw this issue, but could only offer a literalized solution to it. He was not able to see it as a psychological problem involving the deepest levels of our modern consciousness, resting as it does on a very weak foundation of the animal psyche. It appears that our species depends on a certain development taking place quickly, and this fact shows up as images of the young, weak, and immature. A huge transformation in consciousness is taking place, supported on a relatively weak base, what I'm calling the animal psyche. Such a structure generates a feeling, on the human level, of being too young, bearing too much responsibility, being abandoned or let down by parents, left to assume responsibilities that one is not prepared for. Picasso's famous painting, The Minotauromachy, pictures this precarious situation. The monster approaches, the Minotaur, civilization, and everyone flees except a young girl who stands to meet him, with only a light in one hand and some flowers in the other. These characteristics appear in my dream, as they do in Dix Valis, where the hero, horse lover fat, is paired with feminine figures who are dying, ill, frail, and in need of rescuing, unable to cope. In my case, although the situation was dire, there was also the possibility of the calf making it and growing into a mighty bull, which can thus easily support the serpent. I held on to that possibility for many years as I slowly learned to assume the burden of the cobra. The impersonal nature of the burrowing spirit can easily be seen in the fact that the calf was not special in any way. It simply met the criteria needed for the burrowing spirit to get in, that is, alienation, isolation, neediness, and therefore availability. This reminds me of a little book that Owen Barfield wrote, in which he encounters his version of the burrowing spirit in the form of an invisible mentor with whom Barfield enters discussions. At the end of the book, Burgeon, who is Barfield's literary ego, asks the angel why he was chosen. The angel answers simply, "Have you supposed you are the only one? There are others whom you will find, if you have not done so already. The 2 holocausts have touched you comparatively lightly, the reigns of terror not at all. Many would have been reached before you but for the holocausts. The area of our choice at present is not so wide. All my books thus belong to a forming genre of writing that springs from and expresses the burrowing spirit as it makes its way into actuality through the psychological wounds of individual human beings. I had once been terrified writing this way, but now, today, I'm a little more curious, and thus it seems the demand has become gentler, less invasive, but still very insistent. As I said, I believe this genre is still forming, and thus there is no name for it at present, but through the work of individuals such as Dick and Jung, and to a small degree myself, we can begin to get a sense of its phenomenology, what an author may expect to experience if he or she decides to enter the breakdown of categories. Usually this breakdown of categories occurs to one's taken into it and you're immersed in it for as long as it takes. Sometimes it's years, as in my case. Nonetheless, there is something forming. It's a new genre, and it does express the background to our surface reality, a background that at present is chaotic and may appropriately be called the end of the world. This is the title of my doctoral dissertation, The Experience of the End of the World, and it's getting to this issue of the chaos that we've held out for so long is breaking through into our ordered, what Dick would call insane consciousness, so cut off from everything, and if we can stay with it and express it, it'll restore us to a sanity and a connectedness that we haven't known for many, many generations. This connectedness is founded on and depends on the return of what I am calling the animal psyche. While we look around us and see animal species being wiped off the planet at an alarming rate, there is this other movement occurring at the level of the psyche, a new level, a transformed level, where the animals are indeed returning and calling for us, demanding our attention, breaking into consciousness and demanding to be included. This will result in a new structure of consciousness, one that we do not know at this point, but I think this genre of writing, more in its syntax than its content, more in the way it's being written than what is being written about, conveys an animal presence that is sorely needed and may indeed be our cure.